Hey, it's great to be here. My name is J.K. Fowler. I'm the Executive Director of the Bay Area Book Festival, the Merritt Dialogue Speaker Series. Yeah, thank you. The Merritt Dialogue Speaker Series was a speaker series that I wanted to start pretty much on my first day. It's taken us about a year to get it rolling, but here we are. And I just want to thank all of you for being here at this first one. It means a lot for you to come out. I love the city of Oakland. I want to bring programming to the city of Oakland, keep our programming, of course, in Berkeley. So it's wonderful for you to be here. And I appreciate you taking your Wednesday night to be with us. Just a few housekeeping things. As you all probably know, restrooms are at the back. We have drinks, alcoholic and non-alcoholic, back there at the bar. We have books that are for sale throughout the event. We'll also have book signings by each of the authors at the back. So at the end of the event, we'll ask you to line up so it's not complete chaos for Rebecca and Steve. There is also at the back, either at the drink bar or at the book table, there's these raffle tickets. So we're going to try this every Merritt Dialogue Speaker Series. We're going to try to have a raffle. This raffle, we're proud to partner with Oakland Roots. They have offered us 4 field box tickets. So that's right there on the field for the games. It's about $1,000 a ticket, and it's $5 for a raffle ticket. So you do the math. I think it'll work out in your favor. I will tell you, we have about 4 tickets sold right now, so your chances are pretty good. Your chances are pretty good. So the way it'll work is we are going to sell those throughout the event. After the Q&A, we'll do a quick raffle draw, and we'll announce the winners tonight at the end of that. And then we'll go to do the book signings. All right. If you are a staff member related to Bay Area Book Festival, if you are a board member related to Bay Area, or if you are a volunteer tonight, can you just raise your hand, please? So, as you know, it takes a team to put something like this on, especially a new program after we've been doing one major event every year for 12 years now. Next year is our 12th year. So huge props and thank yous to all of the amazing staff that made this possible. We were all carrying chairs, ordering food. It was a beautiful team effort, so thank you to everyone for doing that. I want to talk a little bit about our programming. So Merritt Dialogue Speaker Series is a program of the Bay Area Book Community. What you probably know us for is the Bay Area Book Festival. Next year, that's going to take place May 30th and 31st, downtown Berkeley. We take over downtown Berkeley. About 20,000 people come through. I will tell you that next year's festival is a 40% increase in programming as compared to this year's festival. So we're going to have about 120 panels, about 12 stages activated throughout the 2 days. And then we're going to take over the streets. We're going to have 150 exhibitors. We're going to have a poetry stage. We'll have a youth stage, family stage, and we're going to be in Civic Center Park now that that's opened back up too. So it's a great time. The other thing that we are doing is we have events throughout the year like this one. Between the 2025 festival and next year's festival, we're going to have 16 events. That's here in Oakland, it's in Berkeley, it's in San Francisco, it's in Menlo Park, we're in Petaluma. So we're all doing it in a lot of collaborations, a lot of partnerships. These aren't one-offs just by ourselves. And that means a lot to the work that we do. So thank you also for being in collaboration with us as we try to build out this additional programming. All right, enough of that. We have an amazing program for you tonight. I'm very excited to introduce Jane Kim. For those of you who do not know her, Jane Kim is a trailblazing advocate for justice and equity. She's the California director of the Working Families Party. From her years on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors to her statewide organizing for a multiracial democracy, Jane's work reflects the very spirit of this series, the Merritt Dialogue Speaker Series. It's bold, inclusive, and deeply rooted in community. So she will be guiding us through today's conversation with brilliance and conviction, I am sure. And please join me in welcoming to the stage Jane Kim.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here tonight. I am actually going to be sitting with two of my favorite individuals in the Bay Area who are actually also my neighbors. And I found out tonight are meeting each other for the first time, even though they live within blocks of one another in San Francisco. So again, my name is Jane Kim, and it's really such an honor to be here at the Bay Area Book Fest. I want to bring onto stage two folks that many of us follow and have read. First, I want to bring up Steve Phillips. Steve, besides being quite tall, is a national political leader. He's a best-selling author and the founder of Democracy in Color. If you have not downloaded and listened to his podcast, they are quite fun to listen to. I see some applause here. And actually a great insider way to get information on what's happening in politics today from a progressive perspective. I actually followed Steve. He was the youngest member at the time ever elected to the San Francisco Board of Education. I followed him some 15 years later to then become the youngest president of the Board of Education after. We were just ribbing about this earlier. And he's someone who's gone on to serve even after elected office, fundraising and organizing throughout the country to help win Democratic and progressive candidates. Our next speaker is Rebecca Solnit. A writer, historian, and activist whose essays and books illuminate the intersection of arts, politics, gender, and the environment. Her most recent collection, No Straight Road Takes You There, offers timely reflections on democracy, hope, and a world in flux, reminding us that uncertainty is a space for transformation. And I had the pleasure of getting to know Rebecca in one of my races for office when I ran for San Francisco mayor, and I was the lucky recipient of having her write poetry on behalf of my race. Rebecca doesn't remember, but I do.
I didn't know it was poetry.
So we're here tonight. It is October of 2025, and here we are again. And speaking with two individuals who have been engaged in the conversation of change and hope and possibility, and has seen the decades of change-making and activism here in this country. I'm just gonna rip the Band-Aid off. Let's go into it. What is your hot take on how we landed where we are today? Hot take. We're gonna go into it. Don't worry. We'll go into the layers. But hot take. How did we end up here? I mean, sometimes I just wake up in the morning. I'm like, how did we get here? Rebecca already has her mic up. Rebecca.
I'll go first if Steve won't. I think the people of this country are so much better than the misrepresentation we get, because it's definitely not representation. Three things that come to mind immediately is all the forms of voter suppression and gerrymandering. I was talking to a friend the other day about when Doug Jones won that race in Alabama. The really obvious take on it was like, oh, the guy who wasn't a right-wing child molester won, that's so great. This was after Jeff Sessions, who I call the Confederate chipmunk, became Attorney General. But if you actually look at how much the vote is suppressed in Alabama, it's like, if there was no voter suppression in Alabama, it probably would have been sending progressive black women to the Senate for decades. And like, Doug Jones was great, but he shouldn't have been our highest, it can get even better. So I think voter suppression, I think media misinformation, and there's a real tendency to pretend that our only problems are right-wing media. But I think mainstream corporate media normalizes, misleads, doesn't cover things, takes liars at face value, like Trump saying that he has nothing to do with Project 2025, being carried out right now by Russ Voigt and Silicon Valley, which has created a huge amount of mental health crises, alienation, isolation, actually sabotaged good local media, which relied on the kind of advertising they no longer get for a lot of its revenue, so they could cover the school board and the city council and the transit issues and et cetera for you. And so I think those are three pretty things in the background, but people are really uninformed and misinformed. And beyond that, in this country, you constantly get these sort of hyper-capitalist, individualistic stories. You're poor because you're lazy. You're sick because you're because you're not an RFK eugenics specimen. And the stories of how it's all connected, of how change takes place, of how our lives are shaped by larger forces, of how we can participate in those large forces, even the entertainment full of lone action figure heroes. I just have seen so few movies in which we're all cheering for the group of people who don't actually look good in spandex clothing, but who have actually persevered for decades to win something that actually changes our lives. So I think we're really missing out on the stories about who we are, where we could be, and that's a kind of cabal of the powerful against the rest of us, would be the summary of all those points. Steve, try and wildly disagree with me.
Yes. Yes to all of that. And thank you, for the introduction. Thank you for having us here. It's a delight to come to Oakland to meet my neighbor, Rebecca, for the first time. And then for mentioning our podcast, Democracy in Color, as well, and as all the heads nodding. We're actually going to try to air this conversation as one of our future podcast episodes. I think fundamentally, one of the fault lines of, I was going to say politics in this country, but really this country, is this ongoing existential battle over, is this primarily a white country or is this a multiracial democracy? And that fight, and I would say my hot take is that the reluctance and failure to intensively engage that fight on the progressive side, while at the same time that fight has been vehemently and aggressively and ferociously waged on the right wing, is why we're in this situation now. And I feel that progressive Democrats are caught, and they have this fear of alienating white voters by being too strong for racial justice and for equality for all of the justices. I mean, most dramatically in this past election, right, the whole failure to, or the reality around the tax on trans and whatnot. Standing for justice and equality is seen by too many as, there's a fear that it's a losing proposition. And there's a reluctance to make that fight, which then dispirits our side, demobilizes our side, while they are waging this unapologetic crusade to make this country white again. And I think that's my hot take around why we're here.
So both of you have extensively written about how narratives shape our political and cultural realities. And by the way, one of my first memories of Steve when he served on the school board was that he waged a fight that actually by the time I joined the school board felt quite passé, which is that he was the first person to diversify the reading list for public high school students in San Francisco in the 1990s. It was so controversial at the time that he was stalked in the way that you could be in the 90s by Fox News at the time. And I remember when I joined the board almost over a decade later feeling like that was a fight that was behind us. And now we're here again with book bans and censorship. So we know that all the sides consider narrative important in shaping our political and cultural realities. So what are some of the most dangerous narratives dominating our nation right now? And how do we even begin to dismantle and address those narratives? Steve, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Rebecca.
So, when I was on the school board, which makes me feel like it was a million years ago, which was not necessarily, although maybe it was to a certain extent, the Stanford, some of the struggles started at Stanford around trying to diversify its curriculum. And then San Francisco had, its required reading for its literature curriculum was Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Mark Twain. And that was the only required books that they actually had in San Francisco. So, and then again, it was a ferocious fight. The phone, well, this is also dating myself. I was going to say the phone was ringing. This is the thing phones used to do back in the day. But literally in the school district office, the phone was ringing every 2 minutes from people all over the country calling. And I remember I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Dick Fagler, who was one of these commentator, Andy Rooney type people, wrote this column in the Cleveland Plain Dealer attacking me. But my mom was like, "Oh, you're in the Plain Dealer," right? And so you had that dynamic. I think that, and this probably in terms, I think both in terms of, Rebecca and I both have books coming out next year, and so I think we're trying to speak to some of that narrative issue. What's fascinating about, I don't know if fascinating is the right word, but what's notable about what's happening at this moment with all of these attacks on DEI and illegal DEI and all of that is there's this unrelenting assault on all of the remedies to inequality. But there's no discussion about the actual inequality itself. And so are we okay with this level of inequality? Just 5 years ago, after George Floyd was killed, there was close to consensus within this country that systemic racism is a major problem. We have to all make efforts to address it. We have to have programs and initiatives. Walmart pledged $100 million and had a center on racial justice. That does not exist on Walmart's website anymore. So to talk about narrative, is inequality a problem in this society? Is it something we care about? Is it something we're going to do something about? And so those, I would say, are some of the things that I'm going to try to get us to contribute to that conversation, to getting that back before us again. Because that, I think, is also part of the opening that this administration has left. Because also they're trying to be too clever by half, trying to use the civil rights laws to claim they're harming white people and whatnot. But they're actually affirming the civil rights laws. And so that, to me, creates some level of opening to say, all right, bring us back to the level of inequality within this country, and what do we think about it, and what are we doing about it, and to force that conversation, because obviously it's not taking place at the moment.
I mean, the question of what's wrong with our stories could go so many different ways. In the most granular and personal level, I think a lot of ways we're just not in a storytelling culture. You know, we're sending tiny snippets as texts or social media posts and sitting around and telling each other the stories of our lives and our dreams and our grandmothers and how we got here and stuff. Isn't happening, you know, in the kind of front porch, bar stool, hangout culture that did exist not that long ago. Looking out here, most of you remember it, I can tell. And but I also think we're so impaired in knowing who we really are in so many other ways. And white men in particular are so convinced there's a zero-sum game. If women and people of color get anything, they get less. And I'm freaked out that it feels like the best the Democrats can do is immigrants aren't criminals, rather than like immigrants are absolutely vital, essential, and central to the society. They make it better. They keep it from completely falling apart on a daily basis. They do all the hardest work, etc. And there's three parallels in the stories that don't get told. There was some recent coverage of a poll that showed that American views of immigration are actually very positive, and it was framed as though like they were not that positive before the election. 64% of people before the election had a positive view of immigration, and like that's already super like that's a majority, am I right? And I did, and then in the present it was like 79 or 83% or something like that. When people think their beliefs are minority beliefs, they feel isolated and marginalized. The same with climate action, the same with reproductive rights. People tend to think a lot of, because of how the mainstream press covers these things, like those are very marginal views, I'm very alone, it would be very hard to win. It makes sense that things are the way they are because this is a minority view, when in fact it's a great majority view and it doesn't get represented. I wanted to scream and throw things during the election when I saw some lady who lives in one of those states whose only goddamn border is Canada, screeching about the border that I'm pretty sure she knew nothing about it and never been to. And it's like, why is that something you want to put on TV? She's not impacted by the border in any meaningful way. She's, unless you want to talk about people sneaking maple syrup and hockey sticks across the border. And, and she doesn't represent a majority voice. She just represents an incendiary one. So I feel like we don't get the stories of who we are, the stories, as I was saying earlier, of how the world gets changed, the stories of what's possible. As a climate activist, the fact that if we actually do what the climate crisis requires of us, we make a much better world in so many different ways. It's not about renunciation and austerity. We live in renunciation and austerity because of all the ways fossil fuel is harmful physically, politically, and because climate change destroys all these intangible things. We could have an abundance of hope, an abundance of confidence that nature was okay if we did what the climate crisis required of us, but we're poor in those ways. So I just think there's thousands of different ways in which changing the world begins with changing the story. The stories have changed so much in my lifetime. There's a kind of story regression going on, and it's not, I wrote somewhere recently, every crisis is in part a storytelling crisis. It's not the only thing it is, and you don't fix it just by telling stories, but you don't fix it if you can't change the story, reach people with a story, tell a compelling and inspiring story where people see, I want that, that looks good, we could be that. That's what the world should look like.
I don't want to hijack service, but I want a follow-up question. To Rebecca, you had mentioned something that made me, I don't know if my clear answer is, and it has to do with this, how much technology has changed and how we communicate. And we have moved to this short form reality. And we're talking a little bit about, like, you have a newsletter now, I have a podcast, right? And that, I don't know if you remember working at a actual newspaper where people typed their stories on pieces of paper and then they got laid out and printed and put on trucks and sent around the city, and that's how you got your information. But I don't know if you have reflections on that in terms of how have you grappled with trying to continue to tell a story and advance a narrative in the context of a very much changing technological reality that we're in?
I think people are actually hungry for stories. I think the huge success of podcasts and radio programs like This American Life is that people want someone to talk to them and tell them stories, and that in a certain way it's not happening face to face in their personal life, but at least they're getting it, streaming into their house. I read just this heartbreaking thing about part of why podcasts I'm not so enthused about, like Joe Rogan's, these kind of right-leaning dude bro manosphere podcasts are so long and rambling, is because incredibly lonely and isolated young men, and they're just to have the background sound of someone talking makes them feel less desperate, and that just felt so sad. I'm trying to write about something related now, and it's this weird thing where it's like, if the guy in that house is lonely, and the guy in that house is lonely, and the guy in that house is lonely, how do you get them all to exit the house and, if they're 12, go kick a ball around together? Or never mind, if they're 40, to go kick a ball around together, or go have a drink, or go, . because part of the rhetoric of of the idea of getting AI therapists and counselors and girlfriends and lovers and et cetera, is that there's capitalist scarcity behind it. And it's like there's 8 billion human beings on this earth. There is not actually a shortage of human beings. As with all capitalism, there's a distribution problem. Just like we don't have an actual shortage of housing in San Francisco, we just have a distribution problem with 30,000 vacant units and 8,000 homeless people. So how do we redistribute humanity? It's a little more complicated even than housing, which is complicated enough, because people have kind of lost the skills, the habits, the resilience to take risks, to connect, to listen, to venture out. But that's something I think about a lot. How do we reconnect? And it's often spoken of, again, in individualistic terms, like, you're lonely because you're the idiot who doesn't leave the house. But, the bowling leagues and church groups and, social aid and pleasure clubs, to cite New Orleans where I spent a bunch of time, et cetera. Like, a lot of people are going to, if they do walk out of that house, those institutions that existed, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and the habits of talking to strangers, meeting up, hanging out, we have to rebuild them collectively, not just individually. And I think about that a lot too.
Mm-hmm. So as we talk a lot about narrative, a narrative that has been dominant in the United States since our founding is the narrative of race. And we can link it back to its roots in colonialism, but this country is rooted in immense violence based on exploitation, enslavement, and genocide. And the narratives that fed into it were largely race-based. One of the critiques of the left, particularly in the last couple of years, and one of the critiques of why some folks feel that we're losing is that we too have become invested in the narrative of race, and that we don't speak enough about class. And so I'm curious your thoughts on this. And Steve, I'm going to come back. This is a question with you, but I'm going to also come back to talk to you about the new American majority. Something that really struck me this past year in 2024 when I was door knocking, and now that I work statewide, I door knock in San Diego, in Riverside, San Bernardino, East LA, Oakland, Sacramento, you name it, I door knocked. And I was door knocking for local candidates, not presidential. And the 90% of our candidates are people of color. And many of the folks that I would knock would be like, yes, is that person running against the establishment, And so I'd say yes, and they support these things. And they're like, great, I'm going to vote for your candidate. And then, because they're already talking to me, and they're like, your candidate and Trump. Right, so, and by the way, my candidate were often women, immigrants, people of color, right? So that narrative that these racist, poor, white working class were bringing Trump into the White House is not necessarily one that I always saw when I was knocking on doors in California. So I'm curious, your thoughts about, does the left need to shift gears on the narrative that we lean into as we talk about winning governing power?
Well, yes, but perhaps not even the way that you're talking about it, right? People keep saying like, oh, the Democrats have to focus on kitchen table issues, and they have, what I really want to challenge these people, and particularly the Ezra Kleins of the world, is they keep saying they should not be talking about these other issues, they start talking about the other, is I want to push them very, very hard. What do they think actually we're talking about? And what are they saying that Democrats were saying that they should stop saying? I mean, Klein's running around on his show, and the little mistake I made of watching some of his interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, he was like, well, Democrats should run pro-life candidates. And so I'm like, well, in Kansas, he's like, in Kansas, whatever, but I'm like, where do you ultimately draw the line? In that so obviously you're prepared to sacrifice a woman's right to choose to win. I mean, Jesse said this, people listen to me, I always have a Jesse reference. Today's Jesse Jackson's birthday, actually. He's like, but we will win and deserve to win. To a certain sense, what's the point? Throw all of these constituencies under the bus, abandon their agendas, so that then you quote unquote win for what? I mean, I would love to challenge Klein on what does he differentiate himself from the Republicans and the right wing. Because clearly thinks there's some kind of amorphous thing that we're actually not doing. So, well, I want to come back to this question also in terms of, like, we were talking beforehand about this whole issue around Donald Trump was run for president 3 times. Twice against a woman, once against a man. And both times he ran against a woman, won. And is that like an irrelevant data point in terms of what's actually going on within this country? So my belief, which I've increasingly come to, and actually doing some polling analysis of it, is that it's what Democrats have not been doing. So I was saying that they have been reluctant to lean into the fight for justice and equality. So we saw this even as far back, right, as I guess far back now, the whole Occupy Wall Street, 99%. I was like, people are like, there was like a lot of uncomfortableness, is that the right word? Discomfort with, on the certainly the Democratic leadership side, with this whole class warfare thing. And I was like, well, if 99% are with us, that's a pretty good numbers to go into class warfare with, right? But there was reluctance to lean into that fight. And it's this pursuit of this amorphous middle that we're going to be turned off, et cetera. And so I think that from a class standpoint, I don't think we went hard enough. We should be fighting in the richest country in the history of the world to end poverty. And where is that agenda? And why aren't we leaning into that and fighting for that? And so that along with, are we actually doubling down and fighting for a society that includes everybody and that deals with and embraces and champions racial justice, but more fundamentally that this is not a white country. So it's not just a question that was part of the conversation, et cetera. The very first immigration law in the history of this country, the Citizenship Naturalization Act of 1790, said that to be a U.S. citizen, you have to be a free white person. And that was the literal definition. And we went to war, and which is something else I didn't fully appreciate until I began to research and write my book. We fought a war over whether or not this was a white supremacist country or not. And the equivalent of 2% of the population was killed in that war. That would be 7 million people today dying in a battle over, is this a white country or is this a multiracial democracy? And I would argue that we have failed to clarify those stakes and wage that battle with the intensity that the opposition is waging against it. And that, I feel, is what our problem is at the doors and whatnot.
If we tried really hard, we could probably disagree about something, but we may never get there. But we do emphasize slightly different things. I would just say, I'm citing Kimberly Crenshaw, the black legal scholar who coined the word intersectional. I've seen so many parts of what's supposed to be the progressive world talk about race without class and gender, talk about gender without race and class, talk about and there's plenty of white guys out there talking about class without race and gender too. And talking about them all at once, I just, is complicated. And there's also this question of what is class that I think gets very blurry. It's often considered to be what you do for a living, although, an adjunct professor at a community college might make $46,000 a year, and a master plumber might make $200,000 a year, or something like that. But the fact that everybody's gotten poorer since Reagan, or not everybody, but the great majority since Reagan came in, and that we dismantled all the kind of beautiful systems, the free tuition that the University of California had into the 1960s, I felt like, and I've been on my own financially since I was 17, and I feel like all the doors were slamming shut behind me and I was sprinting through them. But I also want to talk, I find that phrase, kitchen table issues, so insulting the way that it's used. And I've heard Bernie Sanders kind of say, poor working people don't care about X, Y, and Z, they just care about, and something it's a theory of human nature that we are only about narrow self-interest and survival. That whole what's the matter with Kansas thing was, a kind of left white guy who didn't understand how ideological issues were more important than sort of financial security well-being. And you see people really care about ideological issues that may not affect them personally, at the same time that other issues, like Ezra Klein suggesting we throw everyone who might ever get pregnant under the bus by running anti-choice candidates, is like, and I've seen a lot of people, not continuing to name certain white male politicians, really treat abortion as, oh, but we need to talk about economic issues. An unwanted pregnancy that you cannot terminate, is an economic issue. A child is an economic issue. The ability to control to control your own body is a vital economic issue. It pissed me off so much in the Supreme Court when Amy Coney Barrett overturning Roe versus Wade was like, oh, but now that we have childcare and blah, 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 and people can just work. And it's like, yeah, being a Supreme Court justice while pregnant might work. Try being a janitor or, a farm worker. And so on the one hand, I think a lot more things are kitchen table issues, immigration rights, human rights. Not being shot by the police is a very kitchen table issue because being dead is very personal and very much affects your livelihood and your family's well-being. And so I feel like this sense that, people are self-interested, but I think we're bigger than that. And I feel, again, this is something I think about and try and write about a lot. The stories we get told, the versions of ourselves we get in sitcoms and advertising and stuff, suggests that we're petty, we're selfish, we only exist as private and personal beings, when I think recovering our sense of ourselves as members of civil society, as members of the public, is a big part of what the struggle to rebuild democracy has to be. It's an identity issue in identity politics, maybe not the way people always talk about it. And so that just feels like such an important part of the picture, because we're all ideological and we are passionate about these issues that aren't abstract, because all of them, the environment, immigration, human rights, foreign wars, genocides, access to health care, etc. Like there isn't a wall between the kitchen table and the big world. And so I think we can tell better stories about that. And I think politicians can tell more inspiring stories than talking down to people and telling them that they only care about kitchen table issues. And I just want to add, even though it's a little out of sequence, I love that you brought up Occupy. I remember seeing Jane at Occupy San Francisco. I was here at Occupy Oakland, Occupy San Francisco, spent time in Occupy Wall Street in New York. And at the beginning of it all, an old woman looked directly into a video camera and said, "We're fighting for a world in which everyone matters." And that was, and I love the 99% part, because it wasn't the old kind of like, here's the working class, here's the bourgeoisie, all these weird little subdivide and conquer descriptions. It was like, most of us are struggling, most of us work, most of us want this vision, and that sense of being the majority was so great too. Anyway, that was a little disorderly, but.
So speaking of majority, Steve, I actually remember your book launch, your book reading for Brown is the New White. And we have some of our authors' books out on the table for sale. And this came out in 2016. And I know that you had written it during the 2 terms of the Obama administration, which many of us miss very much. And I remember in 2008, after Election Day, the stories that were written. We now live in the post-racial America. And that we have a coalition now we can never lose again with liberal whites and with people of color and immigrants. We now have a permanent winning coalition. The Republicans will never see the light of day ever, ever again. Fast forward 8 years, and then fast forward another 8 years. What happened to the new American majority?
Well, people failed to invest in it or fight for it. And so that's the thing that drives. Who was I talking to? I think it'll be in actually next week's podcast where we interview Melissa Morales, Somos Votantes, and she's talking about, she's involved in Democratic politics in D.C. There's this notion that, and she was saying, somebody in like some kind of consultant position was saying, like, I don't want us to be talking anymore about sexism and misogyny. And I'm like, when were we talking about sexism and misogyny? Because I must have missed that campaign that was aggressively fighting to redress these types of things. But this is part of what's so pernicious about this moment, is that so many people believe that we waged a battle for equality and that we then lost, and so we can't move anything forward. But we never fought it. And so one of the clearest examples was, I actually think that Joe Biden did a lot of good that people don't give him credit for. But one of the big strategic errors, it's not even just him, it's the whole administration and the mindset and the people around him, is that we had a chance in early 2021. Well, as I try to document both the books, is the level of ferocity to suppress the vote by the right wing, the white right wing in this country. Dozens, if not hundreds of bills to suppress the vote, make it harder for people to vote. We did not lean into the fight for voting rights and to make it easier to vote and to expand democracy and to bring people out nearly at the level at which they were trying to suppress it. And so this is a strategic calculus, and I think it was a fatal strategic calculus that the Biden administration made in early 2021, was that they were not going to fight hard around for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and to fight for voting rights and to fight for against voter suppression. They were instead going to try to pursue this bipartisan bill. It flowed from a theory that the way to bring about change, the way to advance things, was try to persuade people that we're more reasonable and we can work across the aisle and therefore you should support us, rather than doubling down on building the power that flows from maximizing the turnout of a growing new American majority in this country. And the last point on that, which I just did the math recently as I have working on my next book. So I had this graph in the first book, Brown is the New White, showing that every single day the population in this country was growing on a net basis 7,000 people of color as opposed to 1,000 whites. And so I ran those numbers again, just like last month in terms of us finishing this other book up. Every single day, the white population in this country is decreasing. It's a net decrease. And so that is a material basis for a lot of this racial panic that we're experiencing from this administration, is that people fear this reality happening. And so I say that to say is that the numbers continue to exist. And for all of the talk about the erosion, this, that, and the others, I'd like to point out Kamala Harris won every single racial group except white voters, which is a different way of thinking about how this thing that took place. And I actually spend a lot of time really looking at learning from the example of what happened in Georgia, what Stacey Abrams was able to do to change the composition of the electorate, to actually send the literal successor to Martin Luther King to the United States Senate. Looking at Texas. Texas is 60% people of color. The eligible electorate is now 51% people of color. And so, but the voting turnout rates are so much lower for people of color than it is for whites. So the underlying composition of this proposition remains, but there's a reluctance and a fear and a lack of aggressiveness to lean into it, because people feel it's a losing proposition. But the irony is, even that's not even the right word, is the failure to lean into it is what's responsible for us losing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I do want to end on a somewhat hopeful note before we go to the audience Q&A. But something I was reminded recently, actually, at a gathering a few weeks ago in San Diego, was when someone said, you know, we wake up feeling exhausted by the headlines, the onslaught, the attacks, the terrorizing. But it's actually important to remember that this is incredibly, incredibly exhausting for the other side, too. The amount of effort and energy and hate and fear and insecurity that you wake up with every morning to dedicate so much energy to fighting this fight, when they do, as Steve and Rebecca, as you both said, they do represent the minority. And it's not just whites, I mean, they represent a minority in terms of perspective. The majority of Americans support a pathway to immigration, want to see their neighbors integrate into our communities and not torn from their children, their spouses, their parents. And so it's important to remember that as hard as this fight is for us, that it is also hard for them. And Ta-Nehisi Coates also talks about the long arc of the story, the wins, the losses. And I was very struck when he said at one point in the podcast that this is the least racist group of white Americans in our history. And I really sat with that. I really sat with that because I thought back to my childhood in the 80s and 90s, and I was just like, actually, I mean, there are these things where we have moved forward.
I do have to sit with that one for a minute.
I had to sit with it I really had to sit with it. And so, and by the way, he's only one individual, it's one perspective. But as we lean towards the future, because we do wake up every morning and we are still here. Rebecca, your work often urges us to imagine a better future. And Steve, your work emphasizes building political power to achieve these futures. So how do we blend imagination and strategy together? And audience, think of your questions, because we will now soon go to you.
We are living in an unimaginable future. If time travel was real and we could bring our grandparents from 1955 or so into the room and explain how race, gender, technology, environmental consciousness, indigenous presence, like the world has changed so much more than most people, I think, recognize. In ways that are actually really positive. I see the entire Trump MAGA right-wing crusade as telling us something very vital and actually encouraging for us, not for them. Their reactionaries are saying, you all are very powerful, you all change the world profoundly, you meaning queer people, people of color, indigenous people, women, disability rights activists, people who wanted to disassemble the authoritarian hierarchies, environmentalists, and they also say, and that's all one agenda. When we don't even see our struggles as connected and our successes as connected in making a better world, they do. The difference between And often your enemies see you more clearly than your friends. There's so much not recognize our own power and our own victories on our side. But the rest of the right-wing thing is like, you're very powerful, you've changed the world a lot, we fucking hate it, we want to change it back. And I was telling Steve in the green room that I have always heard Make America Great Again as Make America 1958 Again, except when I hear it as Make It 1858 again. But I think if we remember how different the world is than 1955 or 1960, we know it is inevitably changing. There is no stability. That's a fiction that comes from amnesia and lack of vision, amnesia about the past, lack of vision about the future. We can participate in changing it. And I really think that we're in kind of the end game for the right. They hit a fork in the road many years back. I actually am interested in hearing now or later what Steve thinks about it, but they faced a choice at some point, around Nixon or something, where both the racial demographics of what had been a hugely white country and the political progressivism of people in this country was really shifting. The Republicans had two choices. They either had to create a platform that appealed to a more progressive, less white majority, or they had to try and suppress the vote, steal and corrupt elections, and become an anti-democratic force. And Trump attempting a coup on January 6, 2021, all the racism, all the voter suppression, all the persecution, all the misogyny, all the attacks on education, everything else, just feels like that if you've decided that democracy is the enemy, at some level they know they're not going to win free and fair elections. And people with ethics would decide they have to change to win elections, or not run. These people have decided they want to win elections by preventing, as I was saying about Alabama, the majority of people from participating. And people do not like that. And I just find this moment incredibly unstable in a way that for 249 years this country has been fairly stable. Nobody knows what's going to happen next. What I do know is that so much of it is up to us if we show up, how we remember our own power, how different things could be. And so that's kind of what keeps me hopeful. In a way, as much of what I'm hearing from them as what I'm hearing from anybody else.
Yeah, we haven't done a good job of disagreeing, so there is that issue. So yes, amen to all of that. I'll just add two additional pieces, and so in terms of how I think about these different aspects to it. And so one is I have a painting by John Biggers called Cotton Picker. It's this sharecropper reaching over picking cotton. And I have that in my living room. And the reason that I have it is because I was at an event in 1989 in Sacramento. I was in State Rep Maxine Waters' office, and somebody was saying that Jesse Jackson would come out for this rally. Oh, you must be so tired. You're traveling all over the country. You're working so hard. It must be so, demanding on you. And without missing a beat, Jesse says, "It beats picking cotton." And that has always, in terms of framing and putting this, and we were talking about the whole struggle around women's equality and that whole arc, and then that in our lifetimes, women couldn't open a checking account. Right, in terms of at a bank without having
you couldn't tell your husband not to rape you because marital rape was not a concept. There was people just don't remember.
And this has been in our lifetimes. And so in terms of the scale and the scope of change, I think it's important to remember that and where we're at. And then just the other point, the last one is the point about it is interesting about their level for their intensity, because I do believe that they know and fear our power, and that's what is driving a lot of this energy and animus against us. And I think the voter suppression is a backhanded compliment to an acknowledgement that we are actually the majority. Because if they believed that they were the majority, they wouldn't be so afraid of us voting. We would just have elections, and then their ideas and their views would actually prevail. So those are things that give me some level of hope, and that, as much as there is this wide-scale capitulation from almost every sector of our society that should be standing up for the democracy, from court to corporations to the media, et cetera, it's still, not that it could be worse, but there's still a level of it that, when Trump first got in, he said something about, well, I might run for a third term. My first thought was, oh, we're still going to have elections, right? And so that's a good thing. And this level of them trying to redraw the lines in Texas and basically try to manipulate and corrupt the whole process is a reflection of their fear around the midterm elections. And it's an acknowledgement to me that at least there's going to be some elections going forward, which creates our opportunity. And I think that, combined with the underlying quantitative reality, is that if we can actually mobilize our people, that we actually should be able to both take back the House of Representatives next year and then take back the country overall over the next period of time.
So another reminder that Trump is only winning by cheating. And so many of you have gotten ballots this weekend for a special election that we're holding here in California on Proposition 50 to counter the cheating and the rigging that Trump is leading in Texas and now in other states. And so we are responding with Proposition 50, which is a temporary pause on the Citizens Redistricting Committee so that we can fight back. So we're going to take some questions from the audience. So JK has the mic.
Yeah. So before we cut to questions, which we'll do about 10, 15 minutes of questions, Linda here, roll of tickets in her hand. We have 9 raffle tickets. Your chances are still excellent. So if you would like a raffle ticket, put 2 fingers up in the air. Look at that. Linda, you're going to be busy. If you have a question, just put your hand up. And you can do peace sign and you can do at the same time. And Sam, right here, put your hand up, please. Sam will come to you if you have a question. Linda will come to you if you want a raffle ticket. If you want both at the same time, you're just going to have to fight it out. All right.
Alrighty. Let's see. First question in the front row.
I think we have to stop whining about Trump and everything he's doing because they're all horrible, and we should just focus on the strong messages that we do have. Diversity is really good for business. It's really important that when you get health care, you can speak your own language and see somebody that you can relate to, and that pregnancy is a medical condition, and we have to keep the right with doctors and patients to let them make the right decisions for a woman during pregnancy. Because pregnancy can go wrong. It goes wrong every day. And that whole argument about the medical and the clinical part of it has been lost under this guise of, well, women who want to give up their, who want an abortion are just doing it out of convenience or choice. And that's such a ridiculous argument. But the bigger point is I would ask you guys, what are the top 2 things that we should all be doing? Because we're hit with every kind of email and, support this candidate. We should be saying this. We should be blaming billionaires, which I think is stupid. And it's kind of, you can get lost in all of these messages.
And could you say your name as well?
Annalisa.
Annalisa. And by the way, so I can get through as many audience questions as possible, I'm only going to have one person answer each question. So you all are going to have to thumb more it out.
You look ready.
I'll try to be quicker. Well,
2 things. 2 things that you think that we can do.
We each have a newsletter that gives you regular feedback around what's actually happening. So Democracy in Color newsletter, and that Rec has a newsletter as well. And I say that to say that we try to lift up things to focus on. And I think that, I guess I would boil it to 2. One is this Prop 50 piece, is that we're just 2-3 seats away from taking
3.
3 seats away, and that would be enormous in terms of stopping this sprint towards fascism. And so this Prop 50 piece in California is designed to counterbalance the attempted theft of these seats in Texas, and I think it's very important to the fate of democracy is to support Prop 50, to let people know about it, et cetera. That's one thing. And then second to me is this point around just in general trying to encourage greater efforts to support civic participation and voting. Because I really believe that's the fundamental dividing line in terms of how we win and how they stop us winning. And so I guess I'll continue, wrap the commercial by saying if you want to, all of the different things that are out there, the Working Families Party is one of the most sophisticated organizations with presence in all these different states that to become part of that, to support that, you can get guidance around which are the most strategic things at any one point in time to back.
We have a question back here.
Hello, my name is Munira. Thank you for your words so far. Really happy to be here. I work for the Center for Art Esteem. We're an arts education nonprofit in West Oakland. So I wanted to pull on the thread of optimism and ask about a story or highlight you have about what youth on the left are doing right now, and just shine a bit of hope and optimism on the audience.
You want an optimistic story about what youth specifically are doing?
Yeah, if you've met any youth on the left that you're inspired by, or any story you've heard.
And in a way, you can also think about what youth aren't doing. And I don't have a great story that comes to mind, but if you look at where most young people are at, most of them have grown up in a multiracial, classroom and town, most of them don't harbor a lot of the prejudices. They're often very gender fluid. They're not as homophobic, transphobic, etc. They have, in many ways, I think just, they're rooted in a very different reality than the one I grew up in, and I find that encouraging. I know a lot of them are discouraged. It's hard being born, or living most of your life under Trump. If you're 16 years old, you don't remember a lot before him. So, but I have to say I'm a little concerned by seeing how gray a lot of the indivisible anti-Trump demonstrations have been. So I'm not sure I'm giving you what you want, but I do have a lot of faith and confidence in young people, and and I just want to speak to the first question very briefly by quoting my friend Bill McKibben, who I actually have seen people come up and say, what's the best thing I can do as an individual? He always says, stop being an individual, meaning join something, belong to something. Our strength comes when we're together, when we're part of a movement, an organization, a network, a working families party.
I didn't pay our panelists. While we're going to the next question, I will share 3 quick stories. One is my friend is a public defender in Boston, and he just got a case. When ICE came into a neighborhood in Boston, the woman that he's now defending saw one of her neighbors being carried off by ICE, separated from her screaming daughter. And someone dropped their baby bottle, and she ran and she started squeezing milk at the ICE agent. And I was in Los Angeles when the National Guard and ICE was there, and it was extraordinary to see that in times of darkness, in the utmost darkness, that the brightest lights of humanity emerge. When people, everyday people, were running to Home Depot when an Instagram post would come out. People who are not activists or organizers or paid to work in nonprofits, like I am, were showing up to slow ICE down, and it worked. And that gives me hope.
Yeah, in connection with climate change, which I see as a quite major issue that threatens all of the youth, and I think the youth know it, I want to mention a book by a guy named Malcolm Harris. He's a white guy who looks about 12 in his author picture. I never saw him before. It's called What's Left, and it means 2 things: what's left to protect and what is left in this circle. And he covers huge swaths of youth and women and indigenous cultures writing about and knowing what we have to do to fundamentally slow down, close off, stop extracting, and begin to get a hook on the climate crisis. Very real. And I just really encourage it because I don't think it's well known. So I would like to hear from either of the speakers, how to make, I think everything else couldn't be more crucial too. But climate, the other book I want to press, and Rebecca will agree with me on this, is Bill McKibben's new book, which is hopeful. After 40 years of climate activism, for the first time, he's saying we've got a shot at it. It's not in America right now, it's in the whole rest of the world. And renewables have just replaced coal as the major, source of energy in the world. We're like way behind, going further back. So any comments that either of you have on the climate issue would be great.
Yeah, well, Rebecca's the expert on the climate. You've written about this, et cetera. Let me just real quickly on the other point on the young people. One of the things I think we all should be trying to keep our eye out for, and then lifting up and communicating, particularly a lot of the young TikTok people who are trying to use this platform to project different messages. And I think there needs to be a lot more work to promote more of an ecosystem of communication, because a lot of those people actually have, more reflective, et cetera. So that's a thing I would recommend. But on the climate thing, I'll defer to you.
Actually, here's my story about young people. On the island of Vanuatu, or in the students in the Law School of the South Pacific, which is Pacific Islanders, in 2019 asked themselves what they could do about climate. And, you know, in U.S. culture, so often you're told you're nobody, you're nothing, you have no power. You can imagine people telling them that 27 law students, as it turned out to be, you know, in the South Pacific could not change the world. But that was not the premise they acted on, although despite the discouragement they received, they approached Blue Ocean Law Firm, which my friend Julian Aguan, a queer indigenous Chamorro person from the colonized island of Guam, took on with Blue Ocean Law. They brought it to the United Nations, where in 2024 they got a unanimous decision to support their resolution for the International Court of Justice to demand, or to say that every nation is responsible for its climate impact, including for reparations to the most devastated nations. It creates a legal structure for holding countries accountable for climate change in a way they never have before. So in 6 years, because they were patient, because they didn't give up, because they didn't listen to the people who told them and Julian that they were doing it wrong and they would never win and they should let some big white guy law firms take it over. And that was one of the two big things. And, you know, here we are in California, as in Bill McKibben's fabulous new book, Here Comes the Sun, using 40% less natural gas to generate electricity than a year before, because we have had the energy revolution here. Literally, the sun shines at night because we're getting more than 100% of our electricity from solar a number of days in California. The excess now goes into our massive battery array and tides us over in the evening. So a lot is happening on climate. In some, you know, renewables continue to do all these astonishing things. Speaking of nobody being able to imagine the world we live in, the UK closed its last coal-fired plant in September of 2024. You could not have convinced somebody in 1950s England that someday in the not that distant future they would not run on coal. But that's so that story about this huge victory in the International Court of Justice is a story about youth, a story about persistence, a story about change coming from the margins and the shadows, and a story that when we fight, we win.
Oh.
Okay, I have to be strict because we are actually running out of time. I'm sorry. I do want to get some concluding remarks, so save it for your concluding remarks. We're going to take one question. I'm really only going to let one person respond. Because we want you all to buy the books and also get home in a timely manner. So this will be our last question.
Thank you so much for taking my question. I want to ask about something. Oh, sorry. I'm Robin. I want to ask about something I didn't hear you talk about a lot. As a 31-year-old, I have experienced the extinction of practical education in schools, like home ec, woodworking, driving a car, even civic duty, etc., as a major part of the disintegration of community and resilience. Disconnection from the world around us. People don't know their food grows on a plant in the ground, or that wool comes from a sheep and makes their sweaters. How can things be seen as important unless we interface with them? Much like Robin Wall Kimmerer saying, how do we care for the earth if we don't eat berries? How do we connect or care on a larger scale about complex things if we don't as a society even know where the most basic resources come from, or how we engage self-sufficiency through hands-on skills and extrapolating that where we come from?
That's our question.
I think that actually some of that is happening. A lot of young people are realizing that college doesn't necessarily lead to employment and often leads to devastating indebtedness. And I think that there's, you know, the climate to create the energy transition we need so many electricians, plumbers, installers, people who know how to set up a wind turbine or a solar array, rebuild the grid that will transmit all this electricity. So I think we're actually in a moment where people are recognizing, and I agree with you, it's been forgotten, that jobs in the trades are good jobs. And but in a larger sense, I feel really kind of horrified by kids who are no longer free range, no longer having a lot of firsthand contact, whether it's playing in the dirt, riding your bike around town, etc., who are just living on screens, because I think that disembodiment, it disconnects you from the first nature we all have, which is our own body, and its incredible capacity to do and make and take you places, from animals, from nature, from learning the lay of the land and how to navigate, being confident about being out there in the world, and knowing nature. I was super lucky. I grew up in the North Bay. As a free-range kid, everything to the south of us was a town that kids ran free in. Everything to the north of us was open space. A lot of it was dairy farms, but nobody ever told us to not climb through the barbed wire. And I feel that it's hard to get people to care about and protect nature if they don't have a relationship with it. And so for environmentalism, and people often think duty and pleasure are very separate. I think when I did an event with Julian Agwan, the guy who won this case in the International Court of Justice, he said this beautiful thing, because we're going to talk about climate, and which people think is often very depressing. He said, he murmured in my ear, make sure we talk about beauty, joy, and pleasure. And I think the beauty, joy, and pleasure of nature is how you fall in love with it. When you fall in love with it, you realize how necessary it is that we are never separate from it. And from there, you come to defend it and or to take care of it. And I think really nature is part of our birthright, as an experience, and also in terms of a healthy environment, which a lot of poor kids don't have, whether it's the Chevron refinery in Richmond or the rest of it, is also a birthright and is also about nature. So, thank you.
Can you go to the stage?
So we're going to move into closing remarks, and I just want to, first of all, thank the team that is kicking off the first Merritt Dialogue Speaker Series here in Oakland. Thank you for bringing us together, to JK and the team, and Dora. To the questions that have been asked, for us to counter it, we individually can do that just by even coming to this event and being in person and dialoguing with one another. And this is why I'm trying to close out the panel, because I want us to talk to one another and to talk to our speakers, because that is an important part of the shift that we need to hold on to is our humanity. And I heard in a lot of the questions, and even in mine, us talking about optimism and hope, and I think they sometimes get conflated. And everyone's a controversial figure now, but I do remember once hearing Cornel West talk about optimism and hope. And he talked about how an optimist is someone who looks at the evidence in the world around them and thinks that the world is getting better. And he said, I am not an optimist. And then he talked about prisoners of hope. And these are people that look at the evidence in the world around them, and it just doesn't look like it's getting better. But they are prisoners of hope. And they are imprisoned by this energy and spirit to change the evidence in the world around them. So because we are all here out of hope, I wanted to hear our eloquent speakers talk a little bit about how you hold on to hope every single day, knowing what you know, seeing what you see, talking to the people that you talk to. What sparks hope in you and keeps you getting up the next day to continue this fight for our humanity? And Steve, I will start with you.
Well, it's interesting, this quote, that when you were saying that, I was thinking this quote about faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, right? And so one of James Baldwin's books was The Evidence of Things Not Seen. And so one of the things that gives me hope is really just looking at history and what's happening through a lens that other people don't fully see and appreciate. And so I met an unknown state legislator from Georgia in 2011. And then in 2012, that person said to me, there are 1 million eligible unregistered voters of color in Georgia. I am going to register them to vote. And spent the next 8 years supporting that work. And I saw what was possible in terms of then transforming, defeating the then President of the United States, sending Raphael Warnock, who preaches from where Martin Luther King preached from, to the U.S. Senate, flipping control of the entire United States Senate. And so that, and then actually I remember Stacy texted me around 2020 or whatever, it says, thank you for believing in Georgia long before it was rational. And I texted back and said it was always rational. Is that I saw what happened in the 1980s. Jesse Jackson won the primary in Georgia. I saw what happened in 2008 and 2012 when Obama, without contesting Georgia, finished just a few percentage points behind in that state. And so that to me was the evidence of things not seen. And so that's what really gives me hope when we're talking about the numbers and how all this stuff plays itself out. So now my last point would be about somewhat to this point around climate, maybe think about this, but also what we can actually do. And it is the significance as well as the potential of focus on the state and local level. And so, again, I'm not a climate expert. It's not where I've devoted my time and energy. I don't have deep knowledge in that space, but I remember talking to somebody in Texas who was talking about what can be done in the cities and counties to reduce climate by having better policies and better practices at that regard. And so most of the population within even a state like Texas, as well as other places across the country, are in these large urban centers, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, et cetera, where there's more progressive power and control. And so we can start to move an agenda from the bottom up that makes the society better, makes the world better. And this is the other, I don't know what the right word is, I don't know a strong enough word around the craziness of this moment, is that you have this madman in the White House trying to use the money from the federal government as a club against anyone trying to fight for equality and justice and to make this world a better place. But the majority of the money that the federal government has comes from states with Democratic governors. And so he's taking our money and trying to use it against us. But what that shows is that there is power in these states as well. And so that if we carry ourselves with that confidence, that we are in fact the majority of people, which is something I think we've lost coming out after November, and then we focus in not just on the big picture in that regard, but to utilize that majority at the state and local level, to get involved at the local level, to push your city council, to push your board of supervisors, to push your state legislature. We can make a big difference for lots of people's lives in the short term, and then that, to me, is what will change the balance of power within this country.
Václav Havel famously said that hope is not an expectation of outcome. It's an orientation of the spirit. I'm misquoting him somewhat, but that's a famous quote. And what people don't know about it is he said it in 1986 when he had been sent to prison for a substantial sentence for speaking up against a totalitarian regime and was continuing to take risks. And as far as he knew, he was going to live the rest of his life under a totalitarian regime, maybe go back to prison again. He could not have foreseen that 3 years later he'd help topple that government and become the first president of a democratic Czechoslovakia. And I have lived through, and we have lived through, the most astonishing things. I think that, in a sense, we have an obligation to hope, because alternative is to quit, is to give up, is to decide that things are hopeless. I've seen with climate a kind of climate defeatism, climate despair, a kind of cynicism, which first of all pretends to know the future. I've been tempted to yell at people lately, if you know exactly what's going to happen, do you play the horses? And, but it's also breaking solidarity. When we people in the global north leading fairly secure lives, fairly safe lives, decide that we can't do anything about climate, we're telling the global south, go ahead and drown, go ahead and cook, go ahead and starve, and go ahead and become refugees. I see giving up as a form of breaking solidarity with the most oppressed, whether it's Latinos being attacked by ICE right now in Chicago and LA and et cetera, whether it's climate, whether it's victims of police violence. And so, but I'm also, I've been joking, I wear black a lot, that I've made a smooth transition from punk rock black to Buddhist black with a little Sicilian widow thrown in. But I'm still kind of punk rock. Like, our enemies want us to surrender. Fuck that shit. Why the hell would I ever give them the satisfaction of saying, oh, you're right, you're omniscient, you're all powerful, we can't win, I'm just gonna go curl up in a ball, and then I'm just gonna watch a lot of bad TV and eat junk food. We cannot surrender, not least to spite them. But I also think, I was born into a world in which I had so many fewer rights than I did now. I was born into a world in which Jim Crow was still happening. I was born into a world that had made indigenous people disappear largely, and their own struggle to reappear, to participate, to reclaim language, rights, culture, land, power has been one of the miracles of my lifetime. But there's been so many. I was born into a world where to be gay was to be treated as either criminal or mentally ill or both. I'm a year older than Silent Spring. I was born into a world that didn't even have a language for nature and the environment. Obviously, indigenous people and close to the land never lost it, but mainstream society didn't really have thoughts about downstream and downwind and why you shouldn't dump this shit in rivers, and how the pesticides were actually very effective. They were going to kill the bugs you wanted, then they were going to kill the bugs you didn't want and the birds, and then they were going to kill the land, the water, the fish, and us. And so I'm hopeful because I have seen astonishing things. I really thought Nelson Mandela would die in prison with his life sentence. I remember being not so confident about the campus anti-apartheid movement, and yet it helped dismantle apartheid in the same year as all those Eastern European regimes fell. I have seen more than all those things that are tangible and quantifiable and nameable and in the public political sphere, transformations of consciousness. We are not who we were very long ago. This work we do, even when it's subtle and immeasurable and subterranean, is incredibly powerful. We have changed the world profoundly if we show up, if we don't give up, if we remember what we have in common, if we dream big and fight for those dreams. I'm still hopeful. Thank you.
So I would be remiss as the moderator, and I get to hold the mic, if I didn't plug my organization, the Working Families Party. Please check us out. Thank you to both the speakers for plugging us. We've been now in California for our 4th year, and we've already elected over 100 electeds up and down the state from Sacramento to San Diego, and they give me hope. From Rachel Hernandez, who is half Asian, half Latina, in her early 30s, that took on an incumbent, older white man that had been mayor for years and won her race last year, to Jomi Figuera, who eventually later went to college and then ran for city council in Oceanside and San Diego Council, and within 3 months passed the first rent control ordinance in the county of San Diego. These are the stories, again, that give us hope. So there are victories locally and within the state legislature that we need to continue to push. And if we can make our narratives reality here in what we call the super blue state of California, if healthcare could be accessible to all Californians, if we could raise the minimum wage and make housing affordable for all of us, if we can show what it is like when we govern, that is the most powerful narrative that we can share with the country. So I do think that we here in California a very important responsibility, because we do have the electorate that we have. 3 out of every 4 eligible voters under 25 are people of color and immigrants. We have an opportunity in the state to show what it means when we govern, and we can role model policies that will bring real narratives of what this governance can look like for the rest of the country. And that is the task and the action and agenda that I am giving to the audience here in this room today. So please keep showing up in person. Thank you so much to the Merritt Speaker Series for bringing us all together. Please buy the books. And by the way, all of these have been signed by the authors in previous years. I brought them from my bookshelves. But these are the opportunities to meet the folks that are writing these incredible literature on how we can make a difference in the world today, and get them to sign those books and bring them back to your home. So thank you very much. And JK, back to you.
Thank you so much. What an amazing way of starting this Merritt Dialogue Speaker Series. Please give a warm thank you to Jane Kim, Steve Phillips, Rebecca Solnit. Thank you.